Good afternoon. My name is Christopher Sands, and I'm Director of the Canada Institute at the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars. And it's my pleasure to welcome everyone here for a discussion of resilient supply chains and the role that allies can play in securing those supply chains. Very pleased to be co-sponsoring this event with my colleague and friend, Andrew Redmond of the Mexico Institute, and with the U.S. Mexico Foundation, which has funded this research and has brought it to our table. And I'm very grateful for that. So with that, let me turn it over to Enrique Perret, who represents the U.S. Mexico Foundation, to give a proper introduction. Welcome, Enrique. Over to you.
Thank you, Chris. I'm Enrique Perret. I'm the Executive Director for the U.S. Mexico Foundation, based here also in Washington. And thank you to the Wilson Center for this space. 3 months ago, we launched this report. We call it also program, the Allyshoring program, and we feel it's very, very important right now in this region, North America. When we saw an article at the Hill from John and Elaine talking about Allyshoring, we were discussing about the opportunities of the region on factors like the tech race between U.S. and China. We were talking about the mismatch on the supply chain, on the pandemic side between Mexico and U.S. and many other factors, right? Digital economy, that it's a huge part of the USMCA, and many other things. So we found the Allyshoring concept a particular and right on the spot, right? It's like a combination between nearshoring, reshoring, plus national security. So we feel it's good to talk about this new narrative, a reset on supply chains on our three countries. And more because we have this huge platform that is the USMCA. So with that, we will let Elaine and John to present the report and the concept. I'm super happy to have John and Elaine in our side because they are experts on this, not only on supply chain but also in very specific regions in North America. They are both from Michigan. They understand very well the supply chains on the automotive industry, mobility, and more industries. And we have been working with them for already 5 months. It has been a pleasure to work with them, and I hope we will continue working with them in more projects related with Allyshoring. So Elaine, John, welcome, and thank you very much for your time.
Hi, Enrique. Thanks so much, Chris, to everyone. We're so happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. It's a real honor to be part of the platform here at the Wilson Center and to share with you some of the work that we've been doing over the last few months. So I'm going to kick it off, and then I'll hand it over to John, and then it'll come back to my side for a couple of final comments on the work. But first, I wanted to just give you a bit of context. John and I have known each other for a long time. We wrote over 12 years ago on revitalizing the Great Lakes region after my days at Department of Homeland Security, where I ran the Cargo and Trade Office and then was the Acting Assistant Secretary for Policy. I became more and more interested in what was happening between the US-Canada relationship and how we could revitalize our industrial heartland. John had been working on these issues for a long time, and that was the start of our collaboration. And over the years, we've gone on to do other things. John has been in Michigan. I spent some time abroad and have now come back, now based in the DC area. And it was about a year ago that we began this new collaboration around the concept of Allyshoring. And the roots of Allyshoring were actually around some research that I had been doing on China's Belt and Road Initiative, which I started in 2019. I was doing a piece for the Center on Economic and Financial Power at FDD, looking at corruption, and specifically how corruption was becoming part of the operating model of the Belt and Road Initiative, and what the implications of that would be as we think about our own infrastructure and economic security issues. So that report came out, and Allyshoring was one of the terms that came up in some of my research, specifically in a conversation with Bonnie Glick, who is the former deputy over at USAID. And the term really hadn't been defined, but I got to thinking about, well, what does this really mean? And asked John, hey, do you want to collaborate on what Allyshoring could mean in the context of US economic security? And then we hit pandemic. And of course, the focus on supply chains became, it was monumental, still is. And it really started a very broad conversation around resilient supply chains. What does resilience mean? What is our dependence on far-flung origins? Is that going to be a long-term national economic security for us? And what are we going to do about all of this? So in that context, we came out with some of our first articles around Allyshoring, which at its core describes a program of sourcing essential materials, goods, and services with trusted friends. So Allyshoring is about economic security, but the foundation of it is around democracy. And this is what I think differentiates it from talking about nearshoring, for example. So what we're doing is saying, okay, for those who seek to undermine American interests and are using economic levers to do that, we need to be responsive to that in a new way. And the way that we need to do that is by rethinking our strategic alliances and pivoting supply chains, particularly around advanced technologies, emerging innovation, where we need to partner, but don't necessarily want to rely on China. Now, fast forward a few more months, we had the conversation with Enrique, and we all came to the conclusion that Mexico was probably the best case study that we could come up with to really talk about Allyshoring and what it could mean in practice. So our research involved many of the members from the U.S. Mexico Foundation. So these are manufacturers on both sides of the border, the U.S. and Mexico, who have deep and intertwined relationships across this border, and saw the Allyshoring concept as something that would be very meaningful for deepening not only our trade ties, but also getting at some of the broader benefits of a trusted partnership that is rooted in core democratic principles. So in our work, we talk a little bit about that, and I'll come back to that maybe towards the end of our conversation. But what we also realized is that in the US-Mexico conversation, we have a lot of unnecessary and unhelpful rhetoric at the moment, a lot of that around the immigration challenge. But if you really start to peel away these layers, we can link economic security very closely even to the immigration challenge. So when we think about Allyshoring as a concept, it is about pivoting supply chains and deepening that economic relationship. But the benefits of this fall into many, many categories, including an ability to reframe the conversation around immigration. So, so that's the kind of the core of Allyshoring, and I'll now turn it over to John to talk a little bit about the benefits and maybe a bit more around the case of Mexico. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Elaine. And again, terrific to join this discussion, and honored as Elaine is to be part of this and this platform to talk about Allyshoring. As Elaine indicated, I guess I've been in Michigan for 30 years, 20 years of which have been focused on how do we accelerate economic transformation of my home state and this region, with Brookings, with my own think tank, and with as a state elected official for 16 years. And I think it was 15 years ago or 12 years ago when Elaine and I hooked up on some of the binational economic blueprinting for U.S. Canada part of the region. At that same time I met Chris Sands. He was defining and describing how harmonization of our border can accelerate economic growth in this region. So given my work, I am so powerfully aware that our economies, certainly in North America, but also with many countries around the world, are tightly wound, highly interdependent. We have such well-machined supply chains that, I was mortified, I think, as Elaine was a couple of years ago, when pandemic kind of exposed the fragility of some of our supply chains, and that we might be over a barrel in PPE and other things we need with China. That our leaders here in my part of the world, and we're talking about, we've got to onshore everything, and we need to control all our critical supplies. And I was aware that, well, I mean, a couple of years ago when Trump proposed the first tariff with our neighbors, and I wrote a piece for Brookings that this kind of trade war is going to be destructive to the heartland economy that he and we all we want to improve, because you all know, I wrote at that time for Brookings, 50% of our trade, quote unquote, with Canada and 30% with Mexico are intermediate goods, which mean we make things together in these highly wound supply chains, and to try to unravel them would be destructive, not constructive to economic recovery, to growing jobs and economic development in my part of the world. And so that's why we were excited to come together, Elaine and I, and say, no, there's a much better path. Let's lean into this co-production system with our friends and allies and folks who share our values. It will be a much more powerful way to rebound economically, to reforge our alliances, and to, as Elaine noted, to kind of cut China out in areas where we don't want to be hostage to them or have concerns about surveillance or other things that they may be up to. So, having the opportunity then to kind of dig deeper with the U.S. Mexico Foundation on what would ally shoring look like with Mexico, I think we did put together a pretty powerful argument that ally shoring is a very robust strategy to meet U.S., Mexican, Canadian, and all our allies' economic goals, security goals, and political and foreign policy goals through this kind of strategy. And in the report that we published, or U.S. Mexico Foundation published, we described some of the really the top line benefits of ally shoring, which really could apply to doing it with any and all of our allies. So yes, it will decrease our reliance on any one country, our vulnerability to shocks where any actor could over relying on them. It will certainly speed over recovery to do what we need to do to recover together. And it can, I think, accelerate a broader economic recovery by leaning into our partnerships, our co-production arrangements. It will make our supply chains more reliable, resilient, bounce back faster in the future. I really believe it's a path to grow more good paying jobs and expand business more robustly on both sides, or on all sides of our borders in North America and with our allies around the world, as we do more together in co-producing important supplies. We certainly have an opportunity to lean into development of emerging sectors and critical industries that we want to dominate or to have as export opportunities, and do that together. It will certainly enhance our collaboration and our partnerships and really rebuild alliances. And we argue in the paper, if we rebuild our economies and we rebuild our partnerships, we're strengthening democracies. We're rebuilding the democracies to be strong, politically united, and probably the most important feature in the kind of foreign policy context. We make an offer to other countries, whoever they are. If you want to play by the good rules, open, transparent, rule-based international order, then we want to work with you. You can ally shore with us. And it provides an option for countries who want an option to what China is offering them, which is Elaine's work as well exposed, is kind of dependence building and corrupting. And that's a very powerful message and opportunity to offer other countries. We also see, unique as we did our homework with business leaders and others that work on both sides of the U.S.-Mexican border, there are particular opportunities and arguments for why ally shoring makes a ton of sense with Mexico in particular, but many of them apply equally to Canada. You're close by, the transportation costs, it's very predictable. We know what we're getting. We don't have components buried in third and fourth supplies that we don't know where they came from. We have competencies in advanced manufacturing and all sorts of industries that we can mate and match. We already do, and we can expand production and development of emerging technologies. I always point out the window here in Ann Arbor, Michigan. They're training up a robot delivery vehicle as we speak with AI, and we can be manufacturing and developing those types of new mobility systems together, which is very powerful job and business growth opportunity. And finally, we do know how to work together. U.S., Canada, Mexico. We have that kind of framework. Expanding our work together is a very powerful economic engine, political engine for democracies to support each other. And I think we could make and in the case of Canada, it's even a stronger opportunity because some of the issues that, as Elaine noted, complicate sometimes doing business with Mexico don't exist in Canada. The worries about rule of law and the occasional corruption that is of concern. So if anything, Canada has as powerful, more powerful opportunities to ally shore. Mexico certainly have terrific opportunities, and we're leaning into our relationship with each other. We can work through those big challenges, committed to together politically and economically. So we think it's a very potent construct. We're certainly encouraging our leaders in the U.S., our allies leaders to embrace it, appreciate the goods and goals that are achieved for our economic benefit, our national security benefits, and certainly to build kind of a rules-based, liberal, Western-led family of nations that are working together in the international system. Elaine, what did I miss?
Not much. That's great. I'll just close out with a couple of areas where we think there's an opportunity to move forward more concretely with the concept of ally shoring. So what could it actually mean in practice? And here we can draw upon a lot of the feedback that we received from the manufacturers within the U.S. Mexico Foundation, who had some interesting ideas and also gave us a real flavor for some of the pivoting that already happened as a result of the pandemic. So for example, General Motors turned some of its production in its Toluca, Mexico facility towards PPE. Aramark, they did the same thing. There are many examples where the U.S. actually ended up relying on some Mexican-based manufacturing to meet critical needs. Granted, there could have been more of that. There were challenges. In fact, one of the biggest challenges is that the way that the U.S. Identifies critical supply chains, that process and the outcomes are different than how Mexico deems its supply chains critical. So what does that mean? It means there's a bit of a mismatch, and it can result in challenges where maybe a product is available to be shipped during pandemic, but there's no box to put it in. So just to give but one example. So one opportunity under ally shoring is to take the lessons learned from this pandemic period and try to harmonize where we can, so that if we face a global shock, we are able to increase our ability to pivot towards Mexican manufacturing and vice versa. So, what were those barriers and how can we remove them? We will have another global shock, pandemic or otherwise. So how are we preparing for it? So that's one area. The second area is really around transformative exports. And here we have, I think, what is a really interesting opportunity and an emerging story. So Exim Bank last year came out with 11 transformational areas of export opportunity. So these are areas where they're trying to promote U.S. manufacturing and U.S. jobs abroad. It's everything from quantum computing to better water and sanitation related technologies, biotech, renewables, and the like. So why is this important? Well, it's important because there are opportunities for the US to invest in emerging technologies, but getting there requires oftentimes subcomponents and some of that value to come from outside of the US. So while we really don't want to increase our reliance on places like China at this stage, where can we go if we want to further develop these manufacturing opportunities, advanced mobility, for example? Well, we can actually turn to Mexico, where we have a deeply integrated supply chains and a lot of expertise that could be developed even further. So the fact that Exim is looking at creating US jobs is a very good thing. Now we have the new Development Finance Corporation willing to take equity investments in infrastructure and projects abroad. So we could look at whether DFC might be brought into this picture as well to improve US investment abroad, maybe focused on transformational types of projects. So that's the second area. The third area is around the smart border. So if we're to really think through the concept of allyshoring and what it means to have the most efficient border, then the idea of the smart border is not really a nice to have, it's a necessity. So there is plenty that we can do around moving towards digital information, process efficiencies, additional investments that could be made at the southwest border. We talk about it mostly right now in terms of security and the immigration problem, but we need to get back to what it means to have a smart, flexible, resilient border. And this is not only the case for U.S. Mexico allyshoring, it's really for the Western Hemisphere. So that's the third area. And then the fourth area is around rule of law, and really looking at how this overarching frame of allyshoring is about supporting the institutions and the democratic principles that underlie all of this work that give the fuel to the economic security and economic cycles that we're trying to promote. To reframe in terms of this alliance requires us to think through what sort of institutional frames are required, where can we support institution building in Mexico and beyond, and how do we fertilize these programs that really bring consistency around rule of law, level playing field for business, reduce corruption risks. All of this is important for attracting foreign direct investment. We know that. We know that from the manufacturers that we've talked to and from a lot of other work that has been done around that topic. So those are the four areas that we think are ripe for further conversation in the context of this U.S. Mexico model for allyshoring. So I think that's what we wanted to present today. We would certainly look forward to comments and reactions, and back to you, Chris. Thank you.
Well, thank you. I think I'm Tony Wayne. I think I'm going to take over now for the next part of the conversation.
Sorry, Tony.
That's okay. Chris is omnipresent always, and always in our thoughts and minds.
I do my best.
And I do want to mention we're going to have a discussion with several others who've been working on these issues also for a number of years from a different perspective, and then we're going to have an open Q&A. So I'd like to invite all of those who are watching to offer any questions, and you can send those questions to canada@wilsoncenter.org, or you can use Twitter and send them to @Canada Institute and @Mexico Institute. And for those from Canada, Wilson Center is spelled with an ER, not an RE. But we'll look forward to those questions. And now we have the great pleasure to have with us three very expert individuals who have been working on these questions for a number of years from different angles. So we have this excellent paper by John and Elaine, and thanks to the U.S. Mexico Foundation for supporting it. But others have been working hard in these fields for a while also. And we're very happy to have with us Tiffany Melvin, who is the president of North American Strategy for Competitiveness, known fondly as NASCO. And Tiffany has been working with the stakeholders around all of the connectivity across the continent for many years now. And so has been striving to make improvements in that area. And we have Greg Pompili, who is the director of the Center of Excellence for Cross-Border Threat Screening and Supply Chain Defense at Texas A&M. So he's been looking at these same issues with a security perspective, but also with the understanding that trade needs to flow and there needs to be facilitation. And Matt Rooney is the managing director of the Bush Institute SMU Economic Growth Initiative at the George W. Bush Institute. And they've been doing a number of really innovative studies for years, looking at the competitiveness of regional integration around the world and looking at NAFTA compared to the European Union, compared to APEC and others, and trying to identify those areas that actually make an economic collaboration between countries more or less competitive. And a number of other things, including a very interesting study that they just put out a little while ago on the U.S. Mexico Canada agreement. So I'd like to have a little conversation with them, and then we'll look forward to hearing questions and answering questions from all of you who are there. Maybe Tiffany, if I could ask you to start off a little bit, as you've been working with stakeholders, those who are actually moving stuff back and forth across the continent and trying to find solutions to some of the bottlenecks. How have you seen this period of the pandemic, and what issues have really popped up that need to be addressed?
Well, thank you, Tony, and thank you to the Wilson Center for having me. I will say that when I read the report, first of all, I hadn't heard the term Allyshoring before. I've heard every other term of shoring, the reshoring, nearshoring, onshoring, all that kind of stuff, but never Allyshoring. And so I thought, now that is clever. And it's a rifle shot to kind of the NASCO mission, I guess, and so many of our partners that we work with. So I thought the report was excellent. Frustrating that we have to have a report like this at this time. I mean, we've had NAFTA for 25 years. We've had our deeply integrated supply chains. We've had our largest trading partners. We've got $145 million of trade moving between U.S., Canada, and Mexico every hour. So, it's a long time coming. A lot of us, like you mentioned, have been working on trying to emphasize the importance of working with our allies and our largest trading partners and doing more and integrating more and having more industries have deeply integrated supply chains. So I do think, although COVID has, threw us all on our heels a bit, I do think it did help bring to the attention of a lot of people that we have much, much work to be done. And I think this report outlines a lot of that very well. When the pandemic hit, NASCO tried to kind of discuss with all of our members, what can we do? What should NASCO's focus be in this area? And we came up with a concept of a North American emergency supply chain continuity. That's a mouthful, I realize, but the idea is that with all of the mismatch, like Elaine mentioned, between how U.S., Canada, and Mexico were dealing with their critical supply chains, or defining their critical supply chains, or defining essential and non-essential, or closing and opening at different times. And it was this patchwork of different jurisdictions that never really worked together. And the regulations that need to be, I liked in her concrete actions, the lessons learned to harmonize, with some of the rules and regulations and policies that need to be quickly addressed in a future pandemic or a natural disaster, or really just across the board on a daily basis. But so we think it's really important that the purpose behind our emergency supply chain is that we feel like the federal government, we feel it should be the three federal governments, should be actively keeping track of where are our critical supply chains, starting all the way back with raw materials. Where are the raw materials? Where are the manufacturing plants? Which manufacturing plants can quickly switch production, like a Mary Kay that makes makeup can go to hand sanitizer. Elaine or John mentioned GM, some other companies, who can quickly modify their production lines. Where are the warehouses that this stuff needs to be stored? Who are the logistics companies that are most likely to help out in a crisis? How do we keep track of all this information, the end demand, obviously the clinics, the hospitals, but also truck stops and any kind of place that needs to be a service provider for the essential workers and travelers, and keep track of it so we know what we can do in a critical situation to surge production, reduce lead time, and use our continent, our trusted friends, our largest trading partners, our allies, to protect ourselves and not rely so much on foreign markets. So we've been working on this issue. I'm thrilled to death to see this report outlining some of it. Of course, I feel like Canada should, I mean, I know Mexico is the case study, but Canada's right there with them. Our three countries have so much opportunity. We have the resources, we have similar political systems, we have shared cultures, we have so much opportunity on this continent to be the greatest trading bloc and continent on earth and to do even better and more than we have. And I emphasize again the concrete actions that were pointed to, because I feel like for decades now, we've had a vision of what North America can be, and we have made some great progress, but there's so much more that can be done, and we need concrete actions. We can't just talk always about the vision, the vision, the vision. We've got to figure out a way to do little things every day, all day long to make big things happen, and we've got to take politics out of it.
Thank you, Tiffany. That's great. Thanks very much. Greg, would you like to pick up on that from your perspective of those themes and others that you've been focused on, and as you're looking at as we go forward and draw the lessons from the past year?
I'd love to. I want to echo Tiffany's thanks to the Wilson Center and to all the speakers today, because it was heartening to hear there's a larger story and more kind of minds are coming around this. And it's interesting because as a center, we were kind of thrown into a lot of the pandemic just as I got here. And it was amazing how much we didn't know and how much we weren't prepared as a nation in many cases. But one of the things that I discovered was the incredible capacity of private enterprise to move forward. And that was wonderful. But one of the things we're now seeing, and we just had a meeting with some small manufacturers, medium-sized PPE. And one of the things that they're running into right now is something I'll get to, which is a larger story of, yeah, during the pandemic, everybody got this desire that this was going to be, we needed to bring stuff closer to home. As soon as the pandemic started to wane, and all of a sudden they started going back to looking at price and price only. So this idea of Allyshoring is really something that I think helps to bring a focus on the kind of the political risks, the changing dynamics competitively as well as politically around the globe that make it important for firms to help make good decisions. When we talk about the PPE and talking to some of the folks that are in there now, they ran into all sorts of hurdles in terms of doing business, whether it was in Mexico or in the United States. Just because the shutdown basically, balkanized the countries. You couldn't get across the border. So when we think about that, you need to have, as I think Tiffany's mentioned and others, this ability for the governments to work together first to see just exactly how you define the critical infrastructures that are necessary, those industries, and then make sure that you find a way to keep those open, and that the movement of goods is going to be something that we want to see continue. Because for all the planning that you may have, if you close the border for whatever reason, and there could be lots of different reasons to do it, but when you do it, all those plans go out the window. You've got stuff on the other side of a really thin wall that shouldn't be there. Now, when we think about the companies themselves, and again, this is kind of from the perspective of what we've seen just recently, they look at this and they're not necessarily stateless or flagless firms, but their interests aren't necessarily the same as national interests. And I think one of the things, which is, I think something that Elaine and John brought out, we need to find a way to show that, and it's, I love that term about making, the Chinese were trying to make folks dependent on their sources. I think we should show the advantages to having this kind of trilateral or bilateral arrangements to build on the infrastructure, and to really ensure that there is a possibility. It isn't necessarily to say that it's an exclusive possibility, that it's only going to happen between these countries, but it should be one of those things that's always part of an and in terms of where people are going. So our center has been busy. We've got a really large project right now, which we call the U.S. Mexico Task Force, And one of the things that we've been looking at, and I just saw it this morning, was what we called, our analysts have been calling stringency measures across the states. And the noise in that system, both in Mexico, which we have a lot of good data on, as well as in the United States, and what that was doing to economic activity, as well as all the other health considerations, which we know we can't ignore ever. But at the same time, it goes right back to this issue of harmonization, that it would be a lot easier for firms to work if they knew what that playing field looked like. So I'll stop there, but I do want to echo my appreciation for the work that's going on here today. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Greg. So Matt and his colleagues actually have looked at the rest of the world and looked at what NAFTA was doing right, and actually found that NAFTA was the most competitive regional grouping, but they haven't been satisfied. They've noted a little decline in recent years, and they've just come out with some additional recommendations. So Matt, please share some of your thoughts and findings.
Thank you, Tony. Thanks very much for this opportunity, and congratulations to the Wilson Center and the U.S. Mexico Foundation for this report, which I think is very timely and very important. And, you know, as I was listening to the others speak, it struck me, Tony, that you've assembled here an all Texas panel, which I think speaks to the role of Texas in North American trade. The fact that Texas is probably one of the few clear net beneficiaries of NAFTA among the US states, and may also be indicative of the poorly appreciated fact that Dallas, anyway, I won't speak to College Station, but Dallas is almost exactly midway between Mexico City and Toronto. And therefore, it strikes me as reasonable that this panel should be all Texas. So in any case, congratulations for that as well. You know, as we've thought about this, and I'm grateful to you also, Tony, for calling attention to our interactive tool, which you can find on our website at bushcenter.org/North America, where we've looked at measures of competitiveness and measures of economic integration in terms of increases of trade and investment among the three parties. We've benchmarked that against other trading groups and trading nations. And what we find is, as Tony mentioned, that NAFTA is the most competitive among the major trading blocs. If you think about the EU or APEC, which isn't quite a trading bloc, but it has aspirations in that direction. NAFTA is the most, USMCA group is the most competitive among those groups, but its competitiveness is slipping. And one of the reasons it's slipping is the inefficiency of our infrastructure, especially our cross-border infrastructure. It's an area where, in our view, we get in our own way. There are massive mismatches in the way the United States, Canada, and Mexico plan and finance infrastructure in general, but cross-border infrastructure in particular. And of course, cross-border infrastructure is always a political challenge, because it's very difficult to assemble a political coalition around a major infrastructure project where half of the beneficiaries are in somebody else's jurisdiction. And so that, I think, is a challenge that we see around the world. But we have given some thought to that question. And in fact, it strikes me, among the many frustrations in the NAFTA space, the USMCA space, is that after almost 30 years, actually, of economic integration in our zone, we do not have a common approach to planning infrastructure. And the three nations do not work together. They consult at a superficial level, and when we're talking about a cross-border project, obviously communities and others are very deeply involved, but there's really no mechanism for looking broadly and holistically at the transportation infrastructure of North America and making sure that it makes sense from a business perspective, from the perspective of the users of that infrastructure, such that you have bridges being built across the Rio Grande River at places that are not where Walmart would have put them, perhaps, but rather where you have a particularly aggressive county commissioner or a real estate developer who's got the land necessary and who undertakes the expense of securing the necessary permits. So we have proposed and continue to promote the idea of a border infrastructure bank that the three governments could capitalize together, somewhat on the model of the existing North American Development Bank, which despite its name is not, is a U.S. Mexico organization only that's focused on environmental and air quality, water and air quality infrastructure in a margin around the U.S. Mexico border. But it points to the ability of the governments to band together to accomplish something like this. A structure like that offers enormous financial leverage from the point of view of the taxpayer, would take enormous burdens off of public budgets in all three countries, and would also start to give the region a mechanism by which it could look holistically at its infrastructure. You know, not long ago, less than 5 years ago, a new rail bridge was built across the Rio Grande River, the first new rail crossing of the U.S. Mexico border since the Mexican Revolution, a period in which trade between the two countries has increased by more than 10, by a factor of greater than 10. And a bridge is currently under construction across the Detroit River between Windsor and Detroit, massive new project, where for a series of essentially bureaucratic reasons, the United States has refused to participate in the financing. And so the Canadian government is financing the entire project, including the freeway approaches on both sides in the United States as well as in Canada, and the toll inspection plazas on both sides. So that points to the need for a more coherent approach to the planning and financing for these projects. And I think also points to the inefficiency of the existing infrastructure, which tends to increase cost and therefore decrease the competitiveness of our manufacturing platform. And I think a more forthright approach to that kind of integration would pay for itself many times over, and would certainly promote the idea of nearshoring and ally-shoring of those supply chains. So I'll stop there. We have some other thoughts on the subject, but maybe there'll be an opportunity later in the conversation for those. Thanks.
Thank you. Yep, that is very important to get that right. And I remember many long and frustrating meetings trying to get interagency agreement in the United States and in Mexico to work on that bridge and infrastructure.
Yeah.
And that was one of the reasons that we had the high-level economic dialogue between Mexico and the United States, to get ministers involved on both sides to push their colleagues to find solutions. It's very complicated. And I think the same thing is true on the US-Canada border. And that's why this idea is so appealing, because if you start talking about ally shoring or partner shoring or whatever you end up wanting to call it, you have to deal with all these related issues. So one of the questions that started coming in, and why don't I ask also Elaine and John, come on back on, and we'll let you, anybody who wants to answer one of these questions when they come up, just raise your hand, hopefully using the raise your hand function, and I'll see it. So one of a question that's come in really is the idea of Buy America, for example, is often portrayed as a patriotic suggestion, and we should buy America. And in some ways, ally shoring is saying, no, we should, in this case, we should be buying North America. And so how would you deal with that kind of the arguments that come up? What are the counter positions that say, no, it's really better to have a buy North America approach to these issues? Would like to take that one on and offer some thought. And Chris and Andrew Redmond, come on also. Matthew.
I've always thought Buy America was unfortunate. You can see the superficial appeal of it, but what it really does is impose additional costs on public budgets, and by protecting American suppliers from competition. But I would say, by way of a positive argument, is to look at the amount of US content that exists in products that get traded across North America's borders. I think it was a Wilson Center study a few years ago that showed that something like 45% or 40% of the content of Mexican imports into the United States actually represents US content. And I think the proportion for Canada was around 25%. Both of those orders of magnitude greater than any other trading partner. The amount of US content in imports from China, for example, is around 3%. And so that points to the fact that I think it's too simple, too easy to call for Buy North America when you're talking about trade with our Mexican Canadian neighbors.
Thank you. John.
Well, and as I tried to point out, I really believe, and I see it living and working here, if we expand our co-production of our sophisticated products and even many services with our allies, we're going to see more robust job and business growth than if we try to haul them all in and produce them here, which would never work, because any sophisticated piece of equipment, from the phone to the car to that robot delivery vehicle being developed here, is got components from 40, 50 countries often. And we were just talking about, let's take advantage, and it would be so costly. I mean, import substitution has never worked from an economic point of view. It's destructive to job growth, not constructive to job growth. All we're doing is talking about, let's lean into our co-production with our democratic friends and allies, and we're going to see a more robust economic recovery than if we all try to go it alone, which will diminish jobs and business growth in all of our countries, including right here in the Midwest. We have the most to gain from job and business growth in the swing states here, including the manufacturing intensive one, because we can manufacture, design and prototype and manufacture the most sophisticated products in the world. And if we do more of that together, we're going to see a net win-win.
Thank you. And sort of related to this, one of our listeners and viewers raised the issue of labor rights. And if we're going to be doing more ally sharing, partner sharing, we need to make sure that labor rights are being respected. There have been a couple of cases raised just under the USMCA with Mexico going forward. And that does have provisions, of course, it has a whole new labor chapter, which did not exist in the previous agreement. But I don't know if anybody would like to say something about the importance, maybe not of labor rights, but also of harmonization in other areas of regulation also, if we're going to move forward with a continent-wide reinforced production platform. Okay, John, again.
I do not. I guess I'm trying to take back the monopoly of this conversation from Texas to Michigan, get it recentered back here.
Good luck with that.
As you saw, the USMCA, and we certainly have an interest in this country, and it was supported by labor to bake into our construct of agreements with democracies and allies, that they do have an expectation create a dignified and well supported labor regime with ability to bargain, et cetera, et cetera. And I think we have a strong interest in working together with, as this case, Mexico, to support good working conditions, more employment and better pay for Mexican workers, our own workers, which has dividends for a stable economy in Mexico with good well-paid labor there as well as here. That's again a win-win for all of us. And Allyshoring, if we set the terms of what does it mean to Allyshore and create the sort of protocols, these are the rules of the road that we want to work with you. We will lean in to co-produce with you if you agree to a set of expectations for how we play this game.
Thanks very much, Chris.
Yeah, thank you very much, Tony. I really wanted to weigh in on something that's always intrigued me about this concept, which is the term ally as a partner in good governance. There's so much pressure on supply chains now to be transparent to consumers and to shareholders that they are not involved in, forced labor or destruction of the environment or some social injustice. And one of the things about Allyshoring that appeals to me is the notion that governments in Canada and Mexico could be partners in governing this transnational supply chain. That is, helping with transparency and verification and also potentially aligning regulations so that you can gain an efficiency benefit within the region, which obviously requires a partner on the other side that's willing to align regulations. To what extent do you think there's a governmental future for ally shoring? And to put it more in an American context, what does the U.S. need to do in order to sort of validate the concept and really partner with governments in the region to make this concept really meaningful?
Elaine.
Thanks, Chris. John and I talk a lot about this notion of tone from the top. And I think that from the governmental side is really where we need to start. What is the tone from the top? How are we defining the narrative of the US, in this case, Mexico relationship, or US Mexico Canada relationship? And what are the expectations around that in the context of an alliance? I mean, it does shift the conversation. It shifts us away from the sort of narrow areas of discussion around immigration, trade occasionally, something else, into a broader framework that defines a set of principles by which we're then working together. So I don't want to make the answer sound too simple, but I do think that that's missing right now. We've also had some interesting conversations with some of the Mexican manufacturers and officials from Mexico who've reacted to the paper around what it means from each side. So what does it mean for Mexico to act like an ally with the US? What does it mean for the US to act like an ally with Mexico? And it is a slightly different construct than where we are today.
Yeah, no, that's very good. And just let me interject here with a little advertisement for early next week. We will be posting an interview on Mexican labor reform that Andrew Rudman and I had yesterday with two senior officials at the economics ministry in Mexico, with talking about their intention to move forward, the challenges they face, but the progress that they're making. And that relates to the mention of the couple of cases that have been highlighted recently. But Matt, please, I know you wanted to build on what Elaine was saying.
Thank you. Actually, I want to make a comment about the labor question that arose a few moments ago, if you don't mind it. And that would be that it seems to me that one of the puzzles in the whole North American economic integration story, which is now almost 30 years old, or more than 30 years old if you count the U.S.-Canada auto agreement, 40 years old, is that during that period of time, there have been dramatic developments in the U.S. economy and both of our neighboring economies. There have been vast increases in national prosperity, increases in per capita GDP. There have been, at the macro level, big increases in manufacturing productivity. When you consider that all three countries have increased their manufacturing output, at least in the United States, there's been actually a continual decline in the number of people employed in manufacturing. So that speaks to a dramatic increase in productivity per worker in the manufacturing sector. But somehow that increase in productivity has not translated itself into equally dramatically growing wages. That's particularly the case in Mexico. And I think that has driven the sense in the United States that these production has moved to Mexico for reasons that don't reflect comparative advantage, but rather reflect a disparity in wage levels, which is greater, as it were, than the disparity in productivity levels. And so there's a rent being captured when one moves production from the United States, or Canada for that matter, to Mexico. And I think that's a central, to me, that's a paradox or a puzzle that's at the core of this process. And it has something to do with the labor markets in all three countries, especially in Mexico. And I would not want to argue that the creation of strong labor unions are the only and the best fix to a labor market that's not working properly. But I do think that the labor markets are not working properly because those productivity increases are not translating into wage increases. And that is having its predictable political effect of dwindling support for trade and dwindling support for economic openness and increasing fear of economic insecurity. So I think it behooves all of us who care about and believe in free trade and open economies to wrestle forthrightly with that question, because it is at the core of the fight that we're currently fighting, I think.
Yes, very good points, Matt. And of course, what it does is raise a whole bunch of other issues like workforce development and training of workers, their opportunities to learn new skills, as well as their opportunities to elect union representatives should they try to do that. So it's, but what's clear is that we're going to start having that dialogue on a regular basis now under this new USMCA agreement. So we'll see if this can help break some of that free and open. John, please. Unmute, John.
Apologize. I wanted to go back to Elaine and Chris's point, but it actually touches on your prior point, Matt. If our leaders in U.S. and Mexico or any of our allies committed to ally shoring, and said, what issues do we need to work through to do it and do it well, it would almost force us to tackle these issues like harmonizing infrastructure that you were raising, Matt, to really get serious about building the smartest and most secure borders in the world. And it would allow us to commit to tackle some of these sticky wickets, including how does a smart, secure border deal with immigration? How does it deal with cybersecurity collectively in our infrastructure and in everything else, which can be a challenge in other countries as in our own countries we're seeing. So it would really push us to make headway on all these points that are so vital, making us even more productive. And again, growing more good jobs and businesses that are co-created with those we trust, who play by, as I said, the good rules.
And it is a reminder that when you're considering this, it goes beyond just simple trade, as you're saying. It's all the items that are related to commerce that can facilitate it, make it more effective, touch the workers' lives, do other things that need to be addressed and talked about. So let me ask, what would be some of the things as an early steps in trying to implement some of the ideas, Elaine and John, that you've put forward, and others can suggest this too, because I know, Matt, you've had some in some of your work for the governments, and Tiffany, you also have in some of the letters you've sent. What kind of things should the governments start talking about that they haven't been talking about, or set up mechanisms for regular exploration, common definitions, ways to move forward?
Do you want me to start with that one? I think it kind of goes back to, I feel like there's a lot of hope with the USMCA platform and the different committees that are created out of the chapters in the USMCA. Hopefully those will stimulate some really good, solid discussions and move each of the different committees and the areas they cover forward. I think when you say, well, I go back to Elaine talking about the top-down approach and setting the tone from the top down. I think the Leaders Summit, I know there's a plan for that to come back, the Three Amigos meeting. That's a huge step forward. That should never have been abandoned, whether you're technically amigos or not, or you have political, your politics align. You should be meeting with the Prime Minister and the two presidents should be meeting on an annual basis. It's too important. And I'll say too that, just to go back to my comment about North America could be the most competitive on earth, and then everyone's saying, well, yes, it already is. I know that, but what I worry about, and I've told Matt this before, because I'm very familiar with his interactive, mapping with the globe and the most competitive regions, but I don't want that tool to be used as a cop-out to say, well, look, we already are the most competitive region on earth, so why is this so critical and urgent? Because I feel like it is absolutely urgent that we do better. Maybe we're getting a B or a B+. I can't remember what we have right now. Like Matt said, it's slipping a little. Other countries, other trading blocs that don't have democratic processes are getting ahead of us, or could very soon get ahead of us. And I think these smart borders are a very low-hanging fruit. Not that we need to start talking about them. We've been talking about, smart borders and what that is, and technology at the borders. The International Trade Data System from 20 plus years ago, was a shot at a single window type initiative, but there is a lot of technology out there that exists today that could be implemented at our borders And I feel like we constantly get caught up on, well, we want the highest tech borders. And so you look to that vision of, well, maybe we need facial ID. Well, but that may take 15, 20, 30 years before all three of our countries are aligned on facial ID at the border. In the meantime, what do we do to reduce congestion and improve security? And there are technologies that are cost effective and that exist today that can be implemented at the border in very short term. Even RFID cards. And I mean, and people say, well, that's a thing of the past. But while we get to the future, let's do a cost-effective way of getting things done at the border for the next 20 years till we get to that point. Let's use the old technology that's very effective and has been proven, tried and true again and again, and can be done very quickly. So I think using the Leaders Summit, having a sincere commitment by all three leaders to set the proper tone and help educate, I mentioned politics. I mean, I think NASCO for decades has been out there trying to teach the grassroots, especially the United States, the importance of trade and free trade agreements, and that everything you touch and see and use got there on a truck, a train, a ship, or a plane, and the cost of goods in the marketplace are directly affected by logistics costs and insurance premiums and fuel. And so if more people understand that trade is personal to them and plays a major role in their lives, I think there's a lot of opportunity to help, educate more people that can maybe possibly help correct some of the politics, the political issues we have that are really holding us back. So those would be my suggestions.
Thank you very much, Elaine.
Yeah, thanks, Tiffany. Great comments. And I just wanted to go back to this point about competitiveness. We may be competitive now, but I think the challenge we're facing is on the level of economic security and what that means in the mid to the long term. And I want to go back to the China question and how the rules of the game have shifted, not only in the trade space, but around global development, which has now become a global infrastructure game by and large. Leadership within the UN, where China has taken on a much more aggressive approach. The rules are shifting, and I think if we're stuck in this construct of saying, well, we're competitive now, that will continue, without thinking through how we need to be responding to these existing and emerging risks, it's going to be a problem. So that needs to be part of this conversation. How are we assessing the risks together, and how are we going to respond to those risks in the context of, let's say, the U.S.-Canada-Mexico relationship? And I worry a little bit that we get complacent, because we have reached a point where we are fairly competitive. And a lot of the manufacturers we talked to about the research said, well, the border's okay. It's not perfect, but it's more or less functional. Is that good enough? We think it's probably not.
Thank you. Matt.
Thank you. We've thought a lot about, Tiffany alluded to the different committees that are created by USMCA, and Chapter 26 in particular creates a competitiveness committee and directs the three governments to meet periodically to analyze the competitiveness of the North American space and to develop proposals for the ministerial level and the leadership level to enhance and strengthen the competitiveness of North America. And so that is an enormous opportunity, and I think an important innovation over NAFTA, which sort of notoriously avoided any sort of governance type structures, and which therefore made it difficult for the governments to kind of review implementation of the agreement over time. We have published a set of recommendations for how the Competitiveness Committee might structure its agenda, focused in particular on these issues we're talking about here today, the workforce development piece, the border infrastructure piece. I think this is an opportunity for the group assembled here today and perhaps many in our audience to consider how they could help encourage all three governments, but particularly, I'm sorry to say, the US government, to think broadly and be ambitious about its approach to the Competitiveness Committee. It should not devolve into a narrow discussion of trade policy equities. It should be broad, it should be holistic, it should be interagency, it should look across all of the elements of competitiveness and be prepared to trample into other agency territory in addressing those concerns. Otherwise, we'll be right back where we were. We'll be right back with USMCA, where we were with NAFTA 5 years ago, where there's enormous frustration because implementation has caused dislocations that haven't been addressed, and there's no mechanism to address them. So this is kind of a generalized call, I think, to all of us who care about this issue to engage with our governments and encourage them to be ambitious and holistic about the Competitiveness Committee.
And I note in that connection that the first meeting of the 3 trade ministers is going to take place next week, the beginning of next week, virtually. But just to second what Matt said, one of the problems with NAFTA was it did just fall into sort of a routine meeting and discussion of the narrow trade issues and not really thinking about is NAFTA really meeting its objectives? Is it still keeping the continent competitive? And this new agreement has these opportunities built into it, but the officials need to hear from stakeholders. That's clear. John.
Building on what Matt and Elaine were saying, the stakes really could not be higher in my view. And this discussion of critical supply chains can seem not very sexy or kind of inscrutable to a lay audience, but we have to realize as we rewire our supply chains, which we have executive order to begin that process on our end right now, we have this opportunity if we take the path of Allyshoring to both accelerate our economic recovery, rebuild our alliances and U.S. leadership of our West-led alliance in the world, strengthen democracy and democracies, and deliver more jobs for people at home, and to demonstrate and answer that question that our president has posed in the strategic competition for who has the most innovative and dynamic economy and who sets the rules of the road for the world, demonstrate that democracy works and is better. I mean, that's really what's at stake.
And in that connection, I do note the Biden administration, of course, has undertaken a number of in-depth studies of several key supply chains, including semiconductors, but also electric batteries and other items. They have an emphasis on talking and working with allies and partners, but they also have an emphasis of investing in America. I think they can all be worked through, but this will demand a kind of a dialogue, a very thorough dialogue with both neighbors, I think, as this goes forward. And in the chat, we have a question about the importance of rule of law in this context and having a solid dialogue about that. And I know that's the harder question, and the questions are aimed at Mexico here in the chat, with people saying we're worried about what's been happening in the energy arena. I don't know if any of you would like to just offer some thoughts about rule of law, about the importance of frankly dealing with policy differences when they come up, as well as, of course, if they violate USMCA commitments, how you deal with those.
Elaine, this is a passion of yours. Do you want to knock this one out of the park?
Thank you for stepping forward, Elaine. It's the harder set of questions, I know.
Yeah, no worries. I don't know if I have an answer or not, but maybe just some observations. I mean, for me, okay, when we were doing our research, I was delighted, but also a bit shocked that in every conversation with our U.S. and Mexican manufacturers involved in the research, every single one mentioned the importance of rule of law for different reasons, but the overarching reason is that rule of law brings foreign direct investment from everywhere, right? Not just from the U.S. into Mexico or vice versa, but from everywhere, which is good for everyone. And it really got me thinking about, well, how do we operationalize that? I've tended to look at rule of law through a very narrow lens, which is around the corruption challenge. I mean, it's a narrow lens, but it's also a huge, it's a huge issue, and in some ways a defining issue, I think. from a broad perspective, I think if we don't have commitment to the rules of the game, whatever they are, if we don't bring that forward and operationalize it in the way that we do business, in the way that we build infrastructure, in the way we handle our trade, and hold ourselves jointly accountable to that, then the framework really doesn't have, it doesn't survive quite as well. We may call it Allyshoring, but really how are we making a distinction between what this is under Allyshoring and what we might do under any other sort of framework? We're saying that there are these common rules of the game and we're committing to them. So that puts burden on systems, especially when infrastructure within government is not there. And so that's a challenge, but it's also an opportunity to help build that. I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. Any other thoughts on that? Well, I have a sort of related. Oh, go ahead, John, please.
I'm just to, I mean, in the big picture, and when Elaine and I found each other again, and she was talking about what she was doing, I would recommend her paper, Below the Belt and Road. It really details, what's the ambition of China at this moment. They really want to replace the transparent, non-corrupt international economic and trade regime with one that is systematically corrupting, that relies on of officials. And so if we don't say we're going to retreat from the world US and produce everything we need ourselves, but we say we want to work with allies in producing our critical supplies and all supplies and grow our economies faster. But the rules of the road are these, that is effective and important, that we offer that alternative system as we've done or tried to do for decades. And we've retreated from the field in the last 4 years. Hopefully now we're back, as our president says. We have an opportunity to, again, reassert the kind of rules-based, rule of law-based, democratic institution-driven, political orders. Even at the micro level, it's not so micro. Elaine and I were both we were making a presentation on Allyshoring yesterday to the Smart Border Coalition, or was it the Supply Chain Network Coalition? I'm getting these presentations confused. They were talking about the challenges posed right now by a bit of a spread of cartel violence on the border in different places, what that is doing to crimp business-to-business travel. And that's rule of law at the the local level of law and order. And so we have to be encouraging and supporting systems that facilitate that. And that's good for business too.
Exactly. That's very important. And one of a related issue that some people wrote in the chat here is, well, what about a qualified workforce if you're going to have investment? And you aren't going to want to invest places unless those workers have some of the basic skills and have the capacity to learn from what they have. And very interestingly, though we often think about the difference between the United States and Mexico, somebody was telling me just recently that in some areas along the Texas-Mexico border, entrepreneurs invite Mexicans to come over to help train their American workers to get up to the skill levels that the Mexicans have on the other side for running some of these factories. So it's not uniform here, but the uniform need is for skilled workers and workers that can learn well, and companies that will help invest working with local governments in that workforce. But I don't know if anyone has any thoughts in that. Matt.
Thank you. Sorry, I'm actually would turn to Tiffany, but I don't want to put words in her mouth. But she and I have worked very closely on this topic over the last several years. And one thing has struck me in particular is there are this incredibly dizzying array of certifications that exist across the North American space, where it's not necessarily clear to a given employer what a certification brings you. what does the worker actually know how to do based on the certificate that he's showing. And I think I think that this is one of the core weaknesses in the Mexican labor market, because the private sector, particularly manufacturing, has over the years gotten used to the idea that it had to do its own training. And so Toyota sets up a plant, they hire Mexican workers, they train them, they have some sort of certification that's marked Toyota. And then Audi comes in down the road and sets up a plant, and the worker goes down there and says, I'd like to apply for a job. And they go, what can you do? So he says, well, look, I have this certification from Toyota. And Audi says, well, I don't know what that means. So if I'm going to hire you, I'm going to have to train you to my specifications. And that prevents the worker from putting himself on that upward ratchet that happens as new investment comes in. And so we've done a lot of work on this, the idea of a sort of uniform approach to workforce training and certification across the North American space, and actually in cooperation with a network of U.S., Mexican, and Canadian private sector interests, successfully put in place the basis for an entry-level certification process that would be uniform across North America. It's got lots of implementations problems. It hasn't been fully scaled, but I think we've tested the concept and proven that it works, and would be useful in overcoming that particular weakness in the labor markets.
Thanks very much. I agree wholeheartedly with that in your effort. John.
And one thing I learned in doing this work on what Allyshoring with Mexico would look like, or could look like, was there's already, even though we should push on to that harmonization, there's already a pretty technologically skilled, sort of competent labor pool and workforce on both sides of the border, particularly in that Texas-Mexico area where we've co-produced many advanced manufacturing and auto-related things for years. And so taking advantage of that reality as we center more, let's again go back to my autonomous robot vehicles that hopefully we're going to be making together. We expand that kind of production. We have a workforce on both sides. It doesn't matter also whether we put some in the Mexico side or some on the Texas side or in Michigan, with the domestic content requirements of sort of North American domestic content requirements. Enrique has the number, but was it every dollar you invest on either side of the border, you get 40 cents or $40 or 40 cents of that is coming back to you in domestic content?
Yep, no, that's right. And of course, this applies to Ontario and Saskatchewan also.
Right.
Sorry, Ambassador. We always said that 40 cents out of a dollar exported from Mexico to the U.S., it's U.S. content, right? And we compare that to other regions. I think it's 1 cent or 2 cents from Asia. That's a study. I think it was made by the Wilson Center, Instituto Mexico, like.
We publicized it a lot. It was a 2010 study done by a couple of very good economists.
Exactly.
And it's 40% of every final manufactured product coming back from Mexico, and about 25% at that time of every manufactured product coming in from Canada. It's probably a little bit less now today because there are much larger imports from China and other things, but it's still much higher than any other part of the world for sure, which is why we're talking about partner and ally shoring, because we do make so much together. Let me just wrap up with one final question for everybody. Of the lessons that came out of some of the crises during the pandemic, like how do you define what's essential and other things, have the governments, to your knowledge, made any progress in regularizing this kind of a dialogue or drawing the lessons so that if something happened again, they would better know what's in the supply chains, or is that yet to be done?
So I'll take a stab at this. I'm not sure. I know that the government, different agencies of the government, especially CBP and DHS, have created, working groups across borders to try to hammer out some of these issues. there's still a huge crisis at both of our borders with the closed borders. And we are working with several other of our partners around North America to try to encourage a safe and secure way to ease those restrictions at the border and get the borders a little bit more open for trade and travelers. Where I think the big problem is that I've been on several different Zoom calls or whatever with several different agencies, with many of our stakeholders, our members, and our partners. And it seems like when we're making the case for whatever it may be, better harmonization, better coordination on essential and non-essential, not having jurisdictional issues with closures and openings and the borders, whatever it may be, we often hear the response, well, it's not just us, we have to follow the scientists or the Department of Health. And so I feel like I've talked with several of our members and partners that a lot of us are getting that there's two things happening. We get that answer, which is that if they're always relying on the Department of Health and science, well, it's often those scientists don't understand the importance of safely and effectively easing our border restrictions and the importance of trade. And so there's kind of a disconnect between the people that do understand versus if the scientists are dictating, well, this is a virus, we've got to keep them closed, then there's never going to be, we've got to figure out a way to get those two to be understanding that there are urgent needs and requirements on both sides of the science argument and the trade and industry argument. My other thing is that we've also heard several people say, well, I mean, we've suggested pilots, doing pilots to reopen the border in a certain border crossing and test to see, or to ease restrictions. I don't want to say reopen, but to ease restrictions and show that it can be done safely. And we're often met with, well, we don't have time for pilots because COVID will be over. By the time we get the results of a pilot, COVID will be over. And that scares us a little because I don't think COVID's ever going to be over. And I think we do need to be doing some pilots because everyone says there'll be another pandemic in our lifetime. So those are my two comments of where I feel like, I do know they're trying. I do know they're having cross-border working groups at the different agency levels, but I also think we've got some big uphill battles still to overcome.
Thank you. Greg.
Thanks. I agree with Tiffany. I'm not sure the government is always the exact best spot to start in some cases. I think this discussion today was really enlightening because we've been looking at some data from primarily US, but also a few Canadian firms in terms of what they're searching for right now and the differences between what they were searching for in 2019 pre-pandemic and 2020. And I think that tells us a little bit about their willingness to go out and seek other partners and other suppliers and sources. And that's going to be important to us. But it also will then help us get an idea about what were the hurdles that they run into when they chose to go that direction. You know, is it a matter of the legal context? Is it a matter of pricing or other issues, or this issue of certifications and harmonization of codes and so forth? I think all those things become important, but you probably could get, and going back to this issue of the critical infrastructures, it's taken the federal government a long time to figure it out, and they still haven't figured out what they're going to do with it once they identify it. We can see that a little bit with the Curtin pipeline situation. So I think what we've got to work with is an opportunity now with this kind of shock that firms are ready to start thinking about, I've got to bring more than just how many cents of labor is incorporated in my good. But at the same time, I'm not going to forget that because I have to go forward and recognize, just as we've seen with the PPE today, the procurers around the country, as much as you might think they're going to wave the flag, they're back to price. And oftentimes when they define the product, they're defining it in terms of the good they get from China as opposed to anywhere in the United States. And those are the kind of things that I think we want to wrestle with, but probably not try to take it on every industry at all, across the board, but pick some low-hanging fruit to work with. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. Matt.
You know, as we're talking, I was just recalling, Tony will recall this, back in the day, those halcyon days of NOWs and pre-COVID North American cooperation, there was a thing called NAPAPI, as I recall. I don't remember now what the acronym stood for, but it was a pandemic and kind of emergency response plan across North America's borders. And it made some progress in terms of
North
making it
American
possible.
Preparedness Initiative. I think it was, right? North American.
Preparedness, and there was pandemic in there. I'm pretty sure that I
Well,
remember
then maybe
the
it was Pandemic Preparedness Initiative.
pandemic
Something like that.
anyway, it made some progress in terms of, making it possible for emergency crews and EMTs and fire crews to cross the border in support of an incident on the other side of the border. But obviously, when COVID came, it seems to have flown out the window, and the three governments, maybe because of lacking relationships among them, or for whatever reason, don't appear to have paid very much attention to NAPAPI when they were designing their approach to COVID. So there is clearly a lot to be done. I don't know what's been done more recently, but I think whatever has been done, in general, whatever has been done, it's not enough. so they should get to work on it. Yeah.
Andrew Rudman has helpfully provided North American Plan for Pandemic and Avian Influenza.
You see, that was our problem. We didn't do it for coronavirus.
Yeah, that's why it didn't work. But you're exactly right. We had a plan and a framework. I remember when I was in Mexico, they would meet periodically and talk about it, and then it fell into disuse over the next few years.
Yeah.
Well, I want to thank everybody who's participated here. I want to thank Enrique Perret for sponsoring this study. I want to thank Elaine and what happened to then John. There you are, Elaine and John, for doing this study. It's super work, and I think it is going to inspire a lot of people to think more seriously about this. It already has. I want to thank Tiffany and Matt and are you here, Greg? There you are, Greg. You move around on my screen, on these Zoom screens. And Greg, thank you all for being with us here. That's one of the challenges of Zoom. People move around. And I want to thank Chris Sands and Andrew Rudman, and maybe they want to say something to close off here as the head of the Canada Institute and Mexico Institute. And I want to thank the staff from the Wilson Center, from the Canada Institute and the Mexico Institute for making this possible. Chris and Andrew, would you like to say some closing remarks?
Well, Tony, this is Chris. I'll just jump in, and since I had a chance to welcome everyone at the outset, I'm going to defer to Andrew for the more serious closing remarks. But just for my part, this was a fantastic discussion. It really brought people together, and I thought we had really a nice elevation, and I want to thank Enrique for allowing us to take the discussion he really gave a spark to on ally shoring with Mexico and include Canada in that discussion as well. This is a North American problem, and I believe in North American solutions for North American problems. With that, let me turn it over to Andrew.
Thanks, Chris, and thanks everybody. I'll just echo what Chris said. This really was a fantastic conversation. Thank you all so much for your insightful and thoughtful comments. I think in the discussion, the point that really ally shoring can be an umbrella under which a lot of issues get addressed, issues that we all know are so critically important, was really one of many takeaways. And I think the other takeaway is that there is just so much more that needs to be done. The governments need to be sensitized, further sensitized to these issues. Matt's reference to NAPAPI and COVID-19 obviously could open up an entirely different conversation about the lessons we need to learn from the pandemic, because as Tiffany said, there will sadly be another pandemic or disruption. But let me just wrap up by saying thank you again to everybody. This was a great conversation. We appreciate the participation of all of our panelists, but also all of those of you watching through Zoom or on the web. Thanks very much, and we look forward to seeing you all again soon.
Thank you. Great session.
Bye-bye, everyone. Have a nice weekend.
Bye-bye.